John Vest is the Extension Agent for Floyd County with the Virginia Cooperative Extension. His expertise helps novice and experienced farmers produce quality livestock and crops throughout our region. John has offered to share his experiences with our audience and provide them with the knowledge to keep agriculture strong. This is the Ag Show with John Vest.
An important consideration when planting the garden is also going to be the size, the scale, the overall operation that you are going to be willing to take care of in the upcoming season. I will tell anyone that comes and visits with me, take the opportunity to plan and plant and be productive with what you're capable of being productive with. Grow an area. It doesn't have to be a half acre of production. It doesn't have to be an acre of production like what we read on the fertilizer bags. Your garden should be a space that is manageable by you with a relatively easy amount or a relatively short period of time and effort needed on a daily basis. And yes, gardens are that, a daily basis where we're out there. You play the role of the monitor or the individual out there looking and recognizing when things are changing with regards to whatever you've planted out and what's growing in that space. If I see spotting of the leaves, if I see insects, maybe I've found the insects in the egg stage and I don't even know what the insects are yet. What a wonderful opportunity to be out there in the garden on that day and pluck away that leaf and dispose of those eggs before the insects ever have a chance to hatch out. It's those things that when I talk to an individual, I encourage plan your garden for the size that you can comfortably maintain. I don't mind if you plant it as close to the house as necessary. It may be in your existing flower beds, as it is at my house. It may also be in raised gardening. That's another entire segment in itself, and container gardening that make it easier for us to access from our patio or our deck or those areas, once again, in close proximity to the house. Or it may be that larger garden out there in the landscape. Regardless, it needs to be something that we can manage both with water and making sure that we can accomplish or provide enough water through those dry months to sustain whatever we're growing. Rule of thumb is we typically want an inch worth of rainfall a week. If I've basically planned a 20 by 50 square foot garden, in that particular situation, I know that spacing my rows appropriately to achieve that inch worth of water in a day's time, I need to leave my irrigation running for a given period of time, maybe an hour in some cases. Some of us may not have the water availability to water a garden for a whole hour, so we'll time things in certain zones. But all of that is part of that planning and determining, hey, this is the size garden necessary that will certainly, we can still feed ourselves, we can still feed our families and neighbors on a much more manageable portion of ground. If we get in that situation where we're planting the huge garden and we're trying to respond with our jobs and activities, our youth sports and things like that, to that our grandparents used to take with the time they spent in the garden, and we're not making our return trips and we're not out there visually and or working that space, we end up in the situation where the garden gets ahead of us, and then we tend to lose out on the overall end result. So once again, just plan your garden with a size that's appropriate to you and your family and a few neighbors, and enjoy that opportunity to get out there. Always involve a young one. If you have an opportunity to get the kids out in the garden or outside, anything is better than this when it comes to getting those kids involved in knowing where their food comes from. And the kids should learn that experience of being outside in the garden and having the benefit of the crop coming in is certainly a very rewarding experience. One of the planning considerations of the garden, particularly for those of us that have chosen maybe to use a different type of mulch material than that of a green mulch. Say we're using a plastic row cover, or we're using some type of landscape fabric, or other means to mulch those grow zones to best keep the weed population down. Because as we all know, the weeds are one of the main components that really work against us in our whole entire effort of growing the crop that we'd like to grow. That being said, in the planting decisions or the planting phase, we have to remember that if we've chosen to use a plastic mulch, or we've chosen to use one of these other weed barrier practices in order to keep those weeds down, that's going to impact our fertilizer selection and or choice with regards to, in many cases, those systems use a drip irrigation just below the plastic or just below that fabric down the garden row. We can't use our standard fertilizers, or we can't use our regular 10-10-10 type fertilizers that we may have used for years and years at 2 to 4 pounds per 100 linear feet of row. In those particular cases, we have to be in that planning process. We have to understand that, hey, I'm going to use a water-soluble fertilizer in this particular system, or if I'm not going to go that route, I need, at that planning and that row preparation point, I need to be incorporating my necessary granular fertilizer and down the row prior to the plastic ever being laid. So once again, within that planning element, take time to recognize, hey, if I'm switching over to something new that may be new to me, something I haven't necessarily practiced before, it's going to impact me in different ways with regards to the garden and its overall performance. If I don't think about those other ways that it can impact me, it can leave me sitting behind the 8 ball there in the end. Also, once we've decided how large that garden space needs to be, we need to think in terms of how that sunlight presents itself, how the height of the crops that we may want to grow, what type of structures we want to include as far as the infrastructure in that garden. And the reason I mention this is we need to think really in terms of our tallest crops first, in that they produce a shade or a shade situation in the garden itself. So if we're thinking in terms of our tallest crops, our corn, or say we're actually going to trellis beans and or cucumbers. If many of us have moving our cucumbers over to a hog wire trellis, it's a wonderful opportunity to get those cucurbits up and off the ground and reduce disease and allow air to transfer through. But at the same time, it's going to create a shadow on as many as 1 to 2 rows on either side. So in terms of planting the garden, those tallest crops usually are located over on the northern, that northern side, the northern exposure. So as that sunlight is coming up and over the garden space as a whole, those tallest crops that we're trying to grow and or trellis are not creating a shade concern on those vegetables in the adjacent row. Additionally, if you're thinking in terms of the spacing within the garden, I like to think of and plan for those spaces based on the length of time that the plant or that particular variety is going to be there. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm having a disturbed garden for one plant that was quickly harvested and accessed, and now it's time to plant something else, but I've got a longer plant in proximity to it. I'm not able to revisit the site or do the necessary work that I'd like to get something planted back. So in terms of planting the garden, once again, plan those varieties And this is what companion planting is to some degree as well. Planting those varieties that can be in proximity to each other, that are going to be relatively close in harvest date or in days of development with each other. That way I'm able to go back, and once those harvests have been completed in the garden, I can come in, redevelop, go through the process of whatever I'd like to plant or replant next, and I can double crop, triple crop in particular instances in that particular garden space. So just another thing in the whole planning and the aspects of deciding what and where within the garden, plant those individuals that are very similar in growth season and harvest date, plant them with each other. And lastly, when it comes to, once again, the actual garden space, for some of us, we have taken that opportunity to plant perennial varieties in our garden. And or we're maybe thinking about how nice it would be to have some asparagus in one side of the garden. There's a situation, once again, that's needing some planning initially so that we can avoid problems later on. Any of your perennial plants that we may consider putting on the edge of the garden or in a particular location within the garden, recognize that's going to be years of production in that particular area. So if I decide that I want to plant out my asparagus crowns in this particular area of the garden, I have to understand that that area of the garden is not going to be suitable for tillage and or heavy equipment access or things making their way or disturbing that particular area where those asparagus crowns are going to be grown for many, many years to come. So once again, whether it be if you're trying to move the raspberries and the blackberries, which I don't necessarily encourage, but if you're trying to, if you have any of those planted or brambles in general planted at the edge of the garden, or if you have the perennial crop such as asparagus, or maybe if you've even gotten wild with things and planted a dwarf fruit tree or so, just recognize you're taking out an area that's no longer going to be really garden accessible in the future. When it comes to planning that garden space and thinking really just deciding on the size, there are a multitude of tools available to us, whether it be online or having that conversation with an extension agent. There's even apps on our telephones anymore that allow us to generate a picture of our overhead space, of our existing yard, maybe our existing garden location, and actually plot and or determine the lengths of our rows, the square footage within that particular garden space. These are all very important from the standpoint of how much fertilizer or how much lime or pH adjustment, how much material is needed to achieve that pH adjustment. So there's lots of tools, I'm saying, at our disposal. I'm not trying to recommend any specific one unless you come visit me in person. I'll gladly show you what's on my telephone. But at the same time, they are very helpful in giving us an idea of what our actual distances are. If we're not out there pulling a tape and trying to determine what the area of a particular grow zone is, in many cases, these tools are a real advantage in planning the amount of fertilizer and the amount of water necessary and those things over the course of a season. I'm going to step to the whiteboard and I'll show you just briefly an example. All right, viewers, pardon my poor artistic ability. I just wanted to show or kind of demonstrate on the whiteboard in planning that garden, and like I mentioned, having the availability really with those tools electronic wise to figure distances. Nothing's changed from the good days of garden math or high school with regards to figuring out the area. And of course, our length times our width of the garden in this particular instance is 1,000 square foot garden. So if we have 1,000 square foot garden, in this particular situation right here, there are those tools available to us that can literally provide us a picture. And by placing a waypoint at the beginning and end of whatever that garden row may be, can give me that length and that distance. If I know that I am planting, basically, let's switch colors here. If I have a 3-foot wide garden row, say here on row 1, and that 3 foot extends to the end of my 50 feet, I now have a 150 foot grow zone in which to grow those particular varieties that I'm wanting to grow. By having an understanding of the distance and the area within each grow zone or within the larger garden area, I'm going to make those decisions at that time to determine how much fertilizer I'm going to need in that season. For instance, in this particular case, if I'm treating a 3-foot wide by 50-foot long row, I'm not necessarily basing it on just the 50 feet in length. I might actually be treating that based on what the fertilizer bag is suggesting in square footage. So always try to, recognize the similar units of measure that you're working with. If you have a fertilizer bag and it's measuring things in linear feet, then by all means, stick with a linear feet of row. If it's measuring in terms or making a recommendation in square feet, we need to be thinking about the actual square footage within that row. Or think of that square footage with, underneath your plastic mulch. And in this case, we'd be treating 150 feet. So with that being said, I would know that I'm looking at 2 to 4 pounds of a 10-10-10 fertilizer per either 50 foot of row or 150 feet or square feet of row. So once again, these tools are handy and available for use, and I hope that you take advantage of them. Play around with them if you have one for an Android phone or if you're an iPhone, if that's your preference. They're available for both. Check them out. And if you're ever visiting with myself, I'll be happy to show you the one I use. Viewers, in closing, I'd like to just go over and mention a few of the things that we've talked about today, just to reiterate the planning process. We talked about being early, getting out there and jotting down or utilizing the materials and the mistakes or certainly the bad situations that arose last year or the previous year, and making sure we have a plan of action on how to deal with them for this current year. We're going to plant and look at those locations that are specific to as much light as we can provide with sunlight. With wind, and we certainly have wind in Floyd County, I would suggest an area that has the garden somewhat protected or maybe at a reduced level from the top of the hillside so that prevailing wind just isn't constantly creating that barrage of desiccating or what we call drying wind across the crops that we're trying to grow. Considering garden location, think about those surrounding areas that it could potentially impact us in the season. From the trees and the things that are already there that create issues for us in a garden growing area, to the spacing away from tree lines or within a garden to allow animals and pests to make their way around a garden and maybe not have the desire to be inside. The soil sampling and the fertilization, it's something to jump on sooner than later. I'd also like to mention with regards to the trees in proximity to the garden, it's not just a shade situation. It's not just a potential for sprouts to be sprouting off their root system, particularly in those invasive species. It's a sheer water competition that I'm talking about between the garden and the trees itself. In many cases, a large oak, or any tree, a large, a maple in as much as 12 inches in diameter, uh, those trees are capable of taking very large amounts of water out of the soil. And that's really why, if you've ever been out in your lawn and landscaping, you see the grass not performing well underneath the tree. It is in part shading from and prevention of sunlight, but it's also the sheer amount of or volume of water that tree is taking up and out of the ground in a given day's time. So if you look and you have your garden planted out in proximity to a large white oak, it's just say 30 feet away, that oak tree is capable of taking well over 100 gallons of water out of its basic root circumference in a given day. And you have to realize that that particular area of the garden may be in need of additional water or additional, certainly, water needs if you choose to plant it there. When it comes to adjusting pH, I didn't mention earlier, that's a relatively slow process. One that takes, once we apply the lime, if we're trying, or wood ash, if we're trying to elevate pH, or if we're trying to add or reduce pH to a more acidic level by adding ag sulfur. Either way, the adjustments made to pH are something that take considerably more time than just a few days or even weeks. So in the process of getting that soil sampling done, make your decisions to adjust pH as quickly as you can. Additionally, the fertilization, the step that's always behind that pH adjustment, because as we grow our plants in our garden area, they utilize those nutrients that we provide for them. If we're not going full circle with the importance of cover cropping and making sure we're putting green manures and other material back each year, then we can anticipate those crops that we grow, particularly our heavy feeders, to deplete those nutrients. So the fertilization is also an important concept to be thinking about, and the cost thereof when we're planting the garden.